Okay, welcome everyone to our next SNARL seminar, the next to last seminar of our series tonight. And just before we get going and before we introduce our speaker tonight, Roland Knapp, a couple of announcements that I'll mention. One is that we still have a few spaces left in our outdoor science education program. So if you have kids or grandkids or neighbors with kids, let them know to check that out online. There might be some spots in the classes of interest. And we also have our public tours for Valentine for the summer posted on our website now too. And so you can go ahead and look at what those are and when they are. We've got tours ranging from geology to black bears to wildflowers, history of Valentine, and it's a great way to get out and see the reserve and learn a little bit more about the environment here. So I welcome you to go ahead and go to our website, click on the Education and Outreach tab, and sign up for a tour this summer. Okay, it looks like we've got a bunch of folks on. And I would like to get going because I know Roland's got a lot of great things to talk about tonight. So it's really a pleasure for me to introduce Roland. Roland Knapp is a research scientist at UC Santa Barbara and has been working at SNARL here for many years. And I would say that Roland and I are kindred spirits because we both started out as marine ecologists and now we have moved up to the mountains far away from the ocean, but doing interesting work nonetheless. So Roland received his PhD from UC Santa Barbara in '92. And since then, he has served as a research biologist at the University of California's Sierra Nevada Aquatic Research Laboratory, where we are. As many of you know, Roland, his research focuses on human impacts to the Sierra Nevada's alpine lake ecosystems. And he's developing methods to restore those ecosystems from impacts caused by the introduction of non-native fish and diseases that have caused the endangerment of once common amphibians, which I'll talk a little bit about tonight. And he, along with Tom Smith, lead the Mountain Lakes Research Group, which is a group that's focused on using science to solve management challenges in the Sierra Nevada lake ecosystems. Roland is also probably one of the most highly regarded and often cited researchers in his field. And he spent more time in the remote alpine lakes of the Sierra probably than anyone I know. He's surveyed over 8,000 lakes in the High Sierra. And we were talking about lakes that do not have trails to them. These are remote lakes. And he and Tom have just published the resulting data set of this project, the Sierra Lakes Inventory Project, based on these surveys. And this data set, I have to say, has formed the foundation for a wide variety of research projects, probably many PhD theses and lots of collaborations in this area. His work was the first to document the many effects of introduced trout on high alpine lakes and to show how trout predators have contributed to the decline of the mountain yellow-legged frogs, which has led to their listing as endangered species along with this fungal disease that he'll mention. So he's continued to focus his work on the conservation and the recovery of the mountain yellow-legged frogs. And as he'll probably talk about tonight, these were one of the most abundant vertebrates at one time in the Sierra, and now they are quite rare. And I do have to embarrass Roland a little bit and talk about one of my favorite characterizations of Roland from a colleague of mine, Paul Dayton. He's one of the most well-known and widely respected ecologists alive today. And so I was talking with Paul Dayton at one point and mentioned that I had left the marine environment and was now living in Mammoth Lakes, running SNARL. And Paul said, well, you'll eventually run into two of my greatest heroes in life, Roland Knapp and John Weyhausen. And I'm sure many of you know John from his work on the bighorn sheep. When you meet them, you probably won't truly appreciate what national treasures they are but were you to try to keep up with them in the field, you surely would. And when you learn that they have accomplished what they have accomplished in your valley, you will want to get down on knees, fingers to the forelocks, and thank them for what they do. So we thank Roland for all his work on the lakes, the frogs, and all that he does to try to restore these ecosystems. And I think it's one of the best aspects of working at SNARL to have a colleague like Roland. And it's my great pleasure to introduce him. In his presentation today, he'll be sharing with us some of the first ever footage of high alpine lakes in winter under the ice. And his talk is entitled Exploring an Unknown World Under Ice Observations of Sierra Nevada Alpine Lakes in Winter. Roland, it's all yours.
Thank you, Carol. Yes, you did embarrass me a little bit, but that's okay. I probably deserve it. So yeah, that's classic Paul Dayton, I would say, but thank you for that. And thank you to everybody out there in attendance, all my unseen audience. Well, today, as Carol said, I'm going to give you a little tour of Sierra Nevada lakes in winter, a tour that is pretty hard to get. Even for those of us who spent a fair bit of time in the last couple of years exploring that under ice habitat. So before I get into my talk, let me share my screen and I'll have some acknowledgements and then I'll dive into the main presentation. Is that all okay, Carol?
Yep, it looks good.
Okay. All right, so I wanted to give a very special thanks to a whole bunch of people here who were instrumental in allowing this work to be conducted and instrumental in actually conducting the work. First of all, Tom Smith and Erica Hageman, two of my colleagues here at SNARL, who accompanied me on these deployments of a remotely operated vehicle into these lakes in winter to observe what is down there under the ice. Both of them very instrumental, not just in this work, but in all the work that we do based out of SNARL. Dr. Stacy Brown, some of you may know as a doctor at the Rural Health Clinic in Bishop. Stacy accompanied us on a deployment and also provided us with the remotely operated vehicle that we used and a bunch of other equipment. So many thanks, Stacy. And also from Yosemite National Park, Rob Grosso and Colleen Kameroff. You'll see a little bit of them later on in some of the video that I'll show. Randy Walker from Caltrans, who was important in us getting up Tioga Pass Road before it was open to the public in midwinter. David Lang, formerly with Open ROV and then with So Far Ocean after those two companies merged. David and those two companies were really helpful early on, training us how to drive the ROV, coming out in the field with us, braving some of the worst sun cups I've ever seen, all in good humor. So many thanks to them. And the National Geographic actually donated an ROV to this effort. So many thanks to them as well. And then Yosemite National Park has helped in myriad ways over the years, everything from funding to permits and everything in between. And one thing that I do want to mention regarding permits is you can imagine that deploying a remotely operated vehicle into a lake in a national park in wilderness probably isn't something that's typically allowed, and you would be correct in that. So I just wanted to emphasize that the work that we did using this ROV was permitted by Yosemite National Park, and it's not something that the public is allowed to do. National parks are drone-free zones, as they say. So with that, I will start in with an image of these lakes in winter. That's the upper image. You can see the ice up above, these large boulders and things that will feature prominently in some of the video that I'll show. And what we know about Sierra Nevada lakes comes almost entirely from studies done during the summer. That's not too surprising, given that in the summertime, that's when you have ready access to those sites. That's when the temperatures and the conditions are relatively hospitable. And it's when you might also expect to see a lot of the life that we expect in the Sierra Nevada out and about. Wintertime is an entirely different world. You're in these lakes, you're talking about water temperatures between 0 and 4 degrees Celsius. So that's 32 to 37 degrees Fahrenheit or so. Often pitch black, and you're talking about pitch black and cold for months on end, 8 to 9 months out of the year, in stark contrast to the short, sunny, warm summer that we experience in the Sierra Nevada. So while it's hardly surprising that most of what we know about Sierra Nevada lakes comes from summertime, it also struck me early on that if we're truly to understand these lakes and the inhabitants of these lakes, we would somehow have to figure out how to study them in winter, at least in a cursory way. We probably would never be able to study them the way we study them in the summer, making detailed observations relatively easily, et cetera. But we needed to figure out how to study these lakes to at least glean some insights into what it's like in this underwater world. And the primary motivation, certainly the original motivation for this thought on my part in terms of how we need to understand these lakes in winter, was the mountain yellow-legged frog that Carol mentioned. This, as I will talk about in a moment, is a species that overwinters underwater in these lakes. And as a consequence of being there in the wintertime, we know almost nothing about what they do down there, even what habitats they use. And I'll talk about some of the different opinions and different information that we have that tells us sort of conflicting stories about what these frogs do out there in winter. So given that mountain yellow-legged frogs are listed under the Endangered Species Act, and there's therefore a strong mandate to recover populations to the extent possible, it was pretty clear to me that if we're going to recover mountain yellow-legged frogs, we better understand at least something about the habitat that is the under ice habitat in which the species spends the majority of its life. The majority of its life is not spent in summer conditions, it's spent in winter conditions. And as such, we need to understand those winter conditions to understand this frog and understand how best to recover it. So let me give a little bit more background on this species. As Carol again mentioned, mountain yellow-legged frogs are formerly abundant in the Sierra Nevada. On the upper right photograph, you see an aggregation of probably 2,000 or so tadpoles, mountain yellow-legged frog tadpoles, doing what they do all summer long, which is as the water warms up in these nearshore areas, they aggregate by the thousands to take advantage of that warm water, speed up their metabolism, and speed up their growth. So the Sierra Nevada and its lakes in particular are known to be low productivity systems. There aren't tons of endemic species or a lot of biomass of those species. And yet mountain yellow-legged frogs somehow manage to be, at least in the best of times, really, really abundant. Probably the most abundant vertebrate in the Sierra Nevada historically. So more abundant than any bird, more abundant than any mouse. Mountain yellow-legged frogs were the species most likely to come to your attention 100 years ago if you were walking around the Sierra Nevada. There's two really interesting natural history attributes of the species that will be important in our discussion today. Number one, they have a multi-year tadpole stage. So a typical frog has a tadpole stage that lasts a single summer. So eggs are laid early in the summer, those hatch into tadpoles, and by the end of summer, those tadpoles have metamorphosed into juvenile frogs. Mountain yellow-legged frogs don't do that. They do something quite different and quite unusual, which is they overwinter as a tadpole at least once. So born as eggs in early summer, they spend that summer as a tadpole. They overwinter as a tadpole. We don't know where. in the lakes they overwinter, but the work that I will talk to you about today is intended to try to figure that out in part. So they overwinter as a tadpole. They come out of winter as a second-year tadpole. They spend the next summer as a tadpole. And at the end of that second summer, they metamorphose and turn into a juvenile frog. And under some climatic conditions, for example, several relatively severe winters in a row, they will actually overwinter into a third year. So they'll overwinter twice, and they'll spend 3 summers before they turn into an adult. Like the tadpoles, adults also overwinter underwater. Many amphibians overwinter in terrestrial habitats. So for example, Pacific tree frogs, a really common frog that we see around here in the Eastern Sierra. That species overwinters in cracks in the rock, typically. So completely removed from the aquatic realm. Mountain yellow-legged frogs, in contrast, spend their winter in the lakes. And again, we don't really know where, and we'll talk about that in detail today. So mountain yellow-legged frogs, once super abundant, they've declined dramatically in the last century, unfortunately, due to both introduced fish and disease. And I'll talk about the disease in more detail in just a moment. But as a consequence of those declines, they're now gone from more than 90% of the historical habitat in both the Sierra Nevada and the Transverse Range, which is the Transverse Range in Southern California, which is the other mountain range in the world that they inhabit. And in the last couple of decades, the species was listed as endangered, federally and state listed across its range. So let me turn now to the amphibian chytrid fungus, this pathogen that has caused dramatic declines along with the declines caused by fish. So the amphibian chytrid fungus has the wonderful scientific name of Batrachochytrium dendropatitis. I will refer to that as BD instead of saying Batrachochytrium dendropatitis too many more times. It is believed, this pathogen is believed to have originated in Asia and was likely spread around the world as a consequence of human commerce. So that might have been commerce in the pet trade, perhaps moving frogs from one continent to another. And we moved more than just amphibians. We unknowingly also moved this fungus. It has caused this pandemic in amphibians. And unfortunately, we're all too familiar with what it is to live through a pandemic. But I want to give you a sense of what this fungus-caused pandemic is like compared to the pandemic that we've been experiencing, the COVID-19 pandemic. COVID-19 has a mortality rate something around 1 or 2%, depending on what country you're in and how old you are, et cetera. The mortality rate in susceptible frogs due to BD infection is often more than 95%. Imagine that in a pandemic, not 1 or 2% mortality, 95% mortality. And that's what mountain yellow-legged frogs experience. They're highly susceptible. They experience upwards of 95% mortality upon getting infected. And what you see on the photograph is the typical consequence of BD arriving at a site. These frogs have never seen BD before. They've never been infected by BD before, and they succumb by the thousands. Mountain yellow-legged frogs aren't alone in their susceptibility. Of this about 6,000 species of amphibians on Earth, more than 500 species have declined dramatically due to BD, and more than 90 of those species are now globally extinct. That impact on amphibian biodiversity has been called the most dramatic effect on global biodiversity due to disease in recorded history. So that's pretty dramatic. And that is what we are faced with when we try to recover mountain yellow-legged frogs. We don't just have introduced fish to contend with, we also have this pathogen. Fortunately, mountain yellow-legged frogs are showing evidence of evolving some degree of resistance against BD, at least some populations are. And that has allowed mountain yellow-legged frogs in some portions of the Sierra Nevada to begin recovering. And that's super hopeful news. And it's something that we've been taking advantage of as we attempt to restore additional populations across the Sierra Nevada. Okay, so habitat use during winter, as I mentioned before, habitat use by mountain yellow-legged frogs is really poorly understood. The lake shown in the photographs on the right, that's the lake in which we are going to deploy the remotely operated vehicle. Obviously, the top picture is summertime. The bottom picture is late winter of 2018. So clearly, very different situations that the frogs confront, and you're going to see some of that up close and personal here shortly. So it's really important that we understand habitat use by these frogs in winter. I've mentioned some of those in a more general sense. I'll mention a couple of specifics here. First of all, we know from work that we've been doing on mountain yellow-legged frogs for the past 20 or more years that winter conditions have really strong limiting effects on frog populations. So if you get several consecutive relatively severe winters, the frog populations exposed to those winters typically show reductions in numbers. And then, of course, as you get out of that cycle of several consecutive wet winters and you get into normal winters or dry winters, the frog population recovers. But nonetheless, we know that these winter conditions are severe and they have dramatic effects on frog populations. As I alluded to in my introduction, there is this uncertainty about where mountain yellow-legged frogs, both as tadpoles and as adults, where they spend their winter. Early work on mountain yellow-legged frogs, or early descriptions, I should say, just gave these very vague references saying, in winter, mountain yellow-legged frog adults and tadpoles spend their time in the deepest portion of the lake. Well, that may be true, but that really wasn't based on observation. It wasn't based on anything except that no one saw mountain yellow-legged frogs except during the summer, and therefore they must be somewhere down in that deep lake. So we clearly need information about where they actually spend their time and how they survive wherever they happen to spend their time. There's also a really important potential effect of frog behavior during that overwintering period on disease transmission, and specifically the disease caused by the amphibian chytrid fungus. You can imagine, for example, that if it's true, as some of those early descriptions that I just mentioned indicate, that mountain yellow-legged frog adults simply swim out into the deepest part of the lake and sit there on the bottom all winter long, perhaps spread out from any other frogs, that's a really different situation for disease transmission than if they're all stacked on top of each other, which is in fact what they do during the summer. In the summer, both mountain yellow-legged frog adults and tadpoles, as I showed you in a previous photograph, just pack on top of each other. And they're taking advantage of environmental conditions by being close to each other that are beneficial. So if you're an adult in the Sierra Nevada in a really dry climate, you dry out more slowly if you pack on top of a whole bunch of other individuals and have other individuals on top of you. For tadpoles, you may actually change the water temperature by having this big mass of dark individuals in shallow water. But those benefits go away, or presumably go away, during winter when there's no temperature differential anywhere in the lake. It's all cold and close to freezing. So those benefits go away. And yet in some species, we do see this behavior of during winter, frogs and tadpoles clumping, and that can have really important implications for the spread of the amphibian chytrid fungus. Okay, so how do you study Sierra Nevada lakes in winter? Well, there's probably a few different ways to do it. We chose to use this remotely operated vehicle. I mentioned before, it was a product of work that was originated by OpenROV, and then when they merged with SOFAR Ocean, it became sort of a joint effort. So this Trident, as it's called, provides high resolution real-time video. The ROV is what you see there in white, this little submarine essentially. That ROV is tethered to the controller that the person on shore is using to drive this thing around via this fiber optic cable. So the fiber optic cable allows the transmission of information from the camera, which is right up here in front, if you can see my mouse pointer, to this controller and specifically to this display. So you can be driving the ROV and be seeing exactly what the ROV is seeing. It also can dive to 100 meters, which is certainly deeper than what we need. But importantly, it can dive for 4 hours at a time, which is a lot longer than you could if you decided to do the relatively harebrained thing of trying to scuba dive under the ice, which would be the other obvious way to try to study these under ice habitats. So it's just really advantageous in a lot of ways, and it worked very well for our purposes. The other benefit is you get to look like a complete dweeb when you're driving this thing around. And that's Tom Smith in the background and Erica in red, and then me with these funny goggles on. Those goggles, they just provide basically a head-up display so that there's a monitor in there that I'm viewing the results from that video feed without all the light coming in and basically obscuring the clear picture that we want. So instead of observing the video on the screen in the controller in my hands, I'm watching the video on the screen in complete darkness, which is really important out there given how bright it is. Okay, so this again is our study lake. This is a bathymetric map of that lake, just showing you the different depths throughout the lake. And of course, the deepest part in the lake, as is typical, is out here in the very middle. It's about 11 meters deep, so about 35 or 36 feet. And this lake contains a large population of mountain yellow-legged frogs, several hundred adults, several thousand tadpoles. So again, a really ideal site to be doing the kind of work that I've been talking about. There's basically 3 general habitat types in this lake, and probably in Sierra Nevada lakes as a whole, and that's deep water. These are relatively uniform, silty, usually relatively uninteresting, just because of the lack of topography and such. Then you have shallow nearshore habitats, so all this area that is colored in red, for example. These are anywhere from 0 to 5 or so, 7 feet deep, typically full of boulders or cobbles or gravel and sand as a consequence of continuous wave disturbance during the summer, washing up any silt away. And then in Skeleton Lake, or in that being our study lake, we also have this habitat that we'll refer to as mid-depth boulders. And those are located right over here in this northern corner. These are not just boulders, they're really large bedrock features that extend from shore into the lake, typically in about 4 or 5 meters of water would be the top of those boulders, and of course deeper at the base. And those boulders have caves and overhangs and cracks and all sorts of habitats that might be of interest to things like mountain yellow-legged frogs. So when we deploy this ROV, we really want to investigate all 3 of these habitat types. And in particular, I wanted to mention one thing that I forgot to mention earlier when I was talking about the overwintering habitats that mountain yellow-legged frogs use, and this disparity between, do they use just deep water sort of silt habitats, or do they use these undershore habitats? The undershore habitat possibility was a result of some really interesting work that was done by Kathleen Matthews, now retired from the US Forest Service. And she showed, using radio telemetry, as well as using some fiber optic scopes, she was able to show that mountain yellow-legged frogs do indeed overwinter in the lake, but they don't go out into the deepest water. They in fact go under the shoreline. So if you can imagine a typical Sierra Nevada lake that's got boulders, and those boulders are then overgrown with oftentimes meadow vegetation. Well, that meadow vegetation that you're walking on as you're walking around the shoreline obscures the crevices and cracks and caves between all those boulders over which the vegetation has grown. And it's into those cracks and crevices that mountain yellow-legged frogs went in Kathleen's study. So they're often 2 or 3 meters from the lake, but in these crevices that contained water and air. So the frogs were really well protected from winter conditions and had access to both air and water. Nonetheless, we're left with this conundrum of, well, was that finding unique to Kathleen's study area in a single basin in Kings Canyon National Park? And usually mountain yellow-legged frogs overwinter in deep water, or do they use both habitats, or do they use only one? So again, the ROV, our hope is that the ROV would tell us something useful about that. Okay, so I'm going to talk first about 3 deployments in 2018. And these I'll refer to as late winter. So that'll be May 20th of 2018. And this is what the lake looked like at that time. And you can see that the lake is completely covered in snow and ice. It's certainly thinning as the days get warmer and longer. And so you can see sort of a blue tint to the snow now. But there's basically no open water except here where the outlet flows out of the lake and the inlet flows into the lake. Right at those junctures between stream and lake, you get some small portion of the lake melting out. And it was our hope to deploy the ROV through those holes because we didn't have any other easy way to do so. Then we had 2 November deployments, the 12th and 18th. So that's early winter. And during those times, this is what the lake looked like. And that is, it was skimmed with a 1 to 2 inch layer of perfectly clear ice. That doesn't last very long because you can imagine as soon as the first snow happens, your perfectly clear ice gets pushed into the lake and is replaced by this white slushy mixture that you see in this upper figure. Okay, so 3 different deployments. I'm going to show you video shot during those 3 different deployments, and I'll point out various interesting features as that video plays. I'll try to use my pointer, my mouse pointer, to highlight some of those interesting things as we go along. Okay, so here's that one of those openings, a small little area where you can drop the ROV into open water and then basically drive it under the ice. So let me get the video up here. Bear with me for just 1 minute. Okay, so this video, there are subtitles just reminding you of the habitat in which the ROV is exploring. So again, deep water, near shore, shallow habitats, and then the midwinter. I'm going to stop this for a minute. And then the mid-depth boulders. There'll also be in the lower left a reminder of the date on which that footage was shot. So whether it was November 12th, November 18th, or that date in early May. Okay, so the ROV has gone into the lake, or it's been usually thrown into the lake, and then it's now being driven into deeper water towards the deepest part of the lake. And here we're right close to the bottom, slowly heading down to that deepest 10 or 11 meter deep portion, just to get a sense of what this bottom looks like all along the way. And do we see any evidence of mountain yellow-legged frogs or other interesting life, invertebrates, etc. And speaking of invertebrates, all these little black dots coming towards you, those are zooplankton. They're small crustaceans, about 3 or 4 millimeters in size, really important in filtering algae from the lakes as their food source. But what I want you to gain from this is just how uniform this bottom is. Uniform in topography, uniform in its color. There's just not a lot of cover out there for something like a mountain yellow-legged frog. So this is a another deployment. This is a week later, but obviously not much has changed. Just a very uniform bottom and a decided lack of any amphibians. We spent a lot of time driving the ROV around in this deep water habitat and virtually never found a mountain yellow-legged frog. So that puts an interesting highlight to that idea that mountain yellow-legged frogs overwinter in the deepest part of the lake. This is a bed of an algae called Nutella. It looks like aquatic vegetation, but it's a multicellular algae. We never knew that it existed in this lake. It's quite uncommon, supposedly, but I wonder how uncommon it really is. This covers hundreds of square feet of the bottom, and we were really curious to know whether their amphibians might utilize this, given that it does have some structure and some cover. And if you look right here, that's a mountain yellow-legged frog tadpole. It's coming out of the Nutella right there. If you followed my mouse pointer, unfortunately, it disappeared very quickly. And that was the only live amphibian we saw during the entire deployment. Okay, so now we're going to switch to the late winter. So this lake has now undergone 7 or 8 months of cold and dark. And now look at what the bottom looks like. It's completely changed. Instead of gray and brown, it's now multicolored. It's got these funny little green fingers sticking up with these yellow balls all over the place. I've shown this video to a lot of people who know a lot about lakes, and no one has much of an idea of what this actually is. Unfortunately, we can't sample it with the ROV, but it's probably some sort of microbial mat. Here you can see in the background, the water clarity is decreasing quite dramatically, and that's because we're reaching the deepest part of the lake where oxygen concentrations are really low. So they're so low that you wouldn't expect much life. We've now turned around and we're coming back to shallower water. Here's the one mountain yellow-legged frog we did see in deep water, and that's a dead tadpole. I suspect it died in shallow water and then got washed down into the deeper water area. But after many, many hours of driving around out there in deep water, that's the only mountain yellow-legged frog we saw, except for the one that we saw in that bed of Nutella. This is a mid-depth boulder that we'll get to in just a moment, but first we're going to go to those shallow nearshore habitats. So again, you might expect to find frogs here, especially early in the winter and late in the winter, if frogs are slowly making their way into those under shoreline crevices and cracks. You might find them, we thought we might find them just sitting here on the shoreline as they get ready to go into this long-term overwintering area. You can see the clear ice above you from these early November deployments. As I said before, sandy, gravelly, cobbly substrate, but hardly an amphibian to be found. Somewhat to our surprise. Again, we spent a lot of time driving around and not finding very much, especially in early winter. As you'll see in just a moment, in late winter, as the lake is beginning to thaw, that changes and we begin to see some amphibians, and you'll see some footage of that in just a sec. Okay, so now here we are, May 20th. You can see the ice cracking and thinning above. So lots of light now getting through. This lake is probably 2 or 3 weeks from icing out. And sure enough, there is a mountain yellow-legged frog. Interestingly, when we find frogs in this late winter period, they're almost always facing towards shore, literally like they are preparing to go onto shore when the lake melts out. Not always for sure, but oftentimes they are facing shore. They're just sitting there on the bottom at 0 to 4 degrees Celsius. And here's another one not far away. That was probably 10 or so feet away from the other one. Okay, so now let's go explore these mid-depth boulder habitats. Again, we didn't know anything about these habitats. We didn't know if they'd be occupied by frogs or not, but they were a consequential enough habitat in terms of their area that we thought we better have a look. So this is all zooplankton you see in the foreground, and then the large boulder feature in the background, and you can see these big caves and cracks and such. Probably very similar in many ways to the undershore habitats that I talked about frogs utilizing in that study by Kathleen Matthews. And sure enough, it didn't take very long of driving that ROV around these boulders to find both adults and tadpoles. So that was 2 adults and a tadpole. Here are 2 tadpoles, a first year and a second year individual. Here I'm driving this thing, trying to drive this into this little cave. And in here you see tadpoles and several adults. You see an adult kicking right there. There's a collection of tadpoles right down here in this little crevice. There's also an adult up here, if you can see my mouse pointer, and a tadpole just dropped down from above. An adult right here, a tadpole here, and there again is that collection of tadpoles. So zooming in on that adult, there it is, nicely positioned in that crack. It seems to be taking advantage of that structure to provide, to obtain protection from ice or predators, or there goes a tadpole swimming by. This is a tadpole as well. And here's several tadpoles and at least 2, if not more, adults jamming themselves into this crack. And for whatever reason, these animals, both tadpoles and adults, are in fact aggregating in winter. And here they are. This is the largest aggregation that we ever found during the deployments. It was in the mid-depth boulder habitats. And this is probably 10 or 20 adults all packed on top of each other. And sorry about the jerkiness here, but here's a whole bunch of tadpoles on the rock, a whole bunch of tadpoles at the base of the rock, and there's even some tadpoles up on top of the rock. So for whatever reason, and we don't know the reason, this species forms these aggregations not just during summer, but also in winter. That's a mayfly right there, not a tadpole. You can see a tadpole's tail sticking out over here on the upper left. Just whacked that frog in the face. And here's another crevice. These are all different crevices that I'm showing you, not the same one over and over. This horizontal crack, and in that crack are a whole bunch of tadpoles. There may be adults in there as well, but the most obvious thing are 20, 30, 40, or 50 tadpoles. This is a crack you'll see in some later video that we shot in 2019 as well. Tadpoles, again, taking advantage of these cracks. You can see their tails sticking out, their heads way back in there. We don't know how far these cracks go in. We don't know how many tadpoles might be back there, but we do know that they are utilizing those cracks. And so here's another boulder on which you have tadpoles just sitting on this flat surface under this overhang. Lots of zooplankton again in the foreground. So you don't see a lot of movement. They're basically just sitting there. They're probably foraging on algae as well at some low level, but at these temperatures, that is 0 to 4 degrees C, there's not a lot of feeding that's going on. So here's another crevice. There's a mayfly right here on the rock. Lots of tadpoles in this crevice. There's a tadpole out here as well. And there's a tadpole swimming deeper into the crevice, perhaps as the ROV gets closer. So lots of zooplankton in the foreground here. Another reminder that there's a lot of life in these lakes, not just mountain yellow-legged frogs. And remember, this is midwinter. There's just literally billions of these zooplankton swimming around, along with hundreds, if not thousands, of mountain yellow-legged frog tadpoles. Okay, so let me stop that. I seem to have lost my mouse pointer for some strange reason. Okay. Well, I'll figure out what went wrong there, but yeah, I've lost my mouse pointer entirely. Let me try one thing real quick. Hold on just 1 minute. This would probably be a very inopportune time for the battery in your mouse to die, but I suspect that's what just happened. Yep, there's my mouse pointer back. Sorry about that. Okay, so let me get back to where we need to be. All right, so there was the part one of the video. I'll show you part two from the 2019 deployments in just a moment. So to summarize sort of generally what we saw, clearly we saw something quite different from what we expected. No animals, virtually no mountain yellow-legged frogs in deep water. Lots of animals on those mid-depth boulders. Unfortunately, we aren't able to drive the ROV into those undershore habitats, just given how small those crevices are. So we don't know if the frogs are utilizing those, but the suggestion certainly is that the frogs are not just out in deep water sitting on the bottom. So lots of questions were raised by that first deployment, of course. And the most obvious thing that came to, I think, all of our minds, those of us involved, was, are the conditions that we just saw during early winter and late winter, in fact, typical of what you would expect to find during midwinter? That is when the snow and ice is at its maximum depth and it's pitch black and not filtered sunlight coming through. So we decided that this ROV technology had been really useful for us so far, and we were going to push it another step, which was to try to get the ROV into our study lake under midwinter conditions. So 2018 that I just showed you video from, that was a very mild winter. So that was 50% of average snowfall. 2019, which is when this photograph was taken in virtually exactly the same spot, was a year with 150% of normal precipitation. So a much more severe winter, which means that on the 8th of May of 2019, our quote unquote lake is largely invisible. You can see a little tiny bit of blue maybe around the edge. That's not water, that's just a slightly thinner ice. There's no outlet that's visible. There's no inlet that's visible. The lake is completely buried in snow, and there's no obvious way to get the ROV into the lake, especially when you consider that that snow at this point in time in 2019 was about 15 feet thick on both land and on the lake. So getting the ROV into the lake is not going to be a trivial accomplishment. How did we do it? That's how we did it. That is a modified ice auger. And when you buy one of these augers, you get the handle and you get this red piece, which is the auger. Those three pieces in between, you see separated by those black knobs, are the extensions that we put between the handle and the auger to give us the length we needed to drill through all of that snow and ice and get into the actual free water. So that is a substantial accomplishment, or a substantial undertaking to try to core your way into the lake, made perhaps 3 times more challenging by the fact that the ice augers that you can buy are much smaller in diameter than the ROV is in its minimum width, its minimum dimension. The ice auger is 6 inches in diameter. The ROV is about 12 inches in diameter. And so you basically have to drill 3 holes as parallel as possible as you're going down through all the snow and ice, and in effect, join those holes together to make one large hole that's big enough for the ROV. This took a lot of time and had some challenges, but we did in fact accomplish what we set out to do, which is we ended up with a hole that was big enough that we could drive the ROV down that hole 15 feet through the ice and snow and water, and finally get into open water down under that ice. Okay, so this is video part 2, and these are the deployments in 2019. We did that quote unquote sort of midwinter deployment on the 8th of May, and another one on the 30th of June, at which time the conditions were pretty similar to what we had in late May of 2018, when you had snow-covered lake, but you had access to the lake via the inlet and outlet areas. So there were some real challenges during the 8th of May deployment due to that darkness. We knew it was going to be dark, but we didn't know what it was going to be like to drive the ROV around in that darkness. It certainly limited our visibility, and you'll see some of that in the video. The ROV has some bright lights on it, but they don't illuminate very broadly, and so you're undoubtedly missing lots. We also had issues with the maneuverability of the ROV because that tether was rubbing against the ice as it went down that hole and then out into the lake. And that just made it hard. The tether's always pulling against the ROV. And again, you'll see that in the video where I'm trying to be as still as possible with the ROV. And it's not nearly as still as I'd like. So I'm going to have to close this window and go find our video. Okay, let me get back to where we need to be. All right. Let me get us back to full screen. Okay, so there's the hole. The feet over there on the left, that's me. And then over here on the right is Colleen helping out. And this strange shadow that you see is Rob Grosso holding the ROV in his hands above his head, or at least it looks like it's above his head. It's probably just at chest level or something. And he's going to push it into this hole. And then I'm going to try to drive it down that hole and out into the lake. So here we go. Very dramatic, Rob. So that hole obviously started as 3 holes and it turned into 2, but luckily those 2 were still created a big enough opening that we could get the ROV into it. Finally got it arranged and drove into the lake. So remember, we're 15 feet down into the lake now. We've just driven through 15 feet of ice. And now we're in total blackness. I left this in here just so you get a sense of how dark it actually is. You can make out rocks here and there. I pointed the ROV towards the top of a rock where the ice is actually sort of fractured around the top of the rock. So you can see a little bit of light getting in, but all the light, all the illumination you're seeing here, except where the light is coming down from this one crack, is coming from the lights on the ROV. That'll be more obvious as we get into deeper water and away from that one crack in the ice. It didn't take us very long to find our first tadpoles, despite the complete blackness. So there's a tadpole. And if you look here in the background, on the top of your screen, there's a bunch of tadpoles sitting on top of this rock, just like we saw them during the 2018 deployments in early and late winter. Very similar behaviors. Again, we don't know why they're doing this. Why are they choosing to sit relatively motionless on top of a rock for months and months on end, presumably? But that's clearly what they're doing. And this, again, is in pitch black conditions. So now driving over to another rock. Actually, this is the same aggregation, just from a different angle. The ice was yanking on the tether, so I had to sort of circle around and come back. And that push and pull that you're seeing here, that's the ice pulling on the tether, something that we didn't experience very much during previous deployments. Okay, then circling around to a different boulder, there's this overhang, and there's a tadpole right there and a tadpole right here. Again, very similar to what we saw earlier, but now in complete blackness. But at least very quickly you get the sense that what we saw in the early and late winter deployments were pretty emblematic of what we saw here in midwinter. There's some mayflies hopping around, by the way, swimming around. So they stay around as well. They stay quite active, as you can see. And then panning over towards the right and down, there's an aggregation of tadpoles, quite difficult to see because of the dark conditions, but you can see the heads of tadpoles on that rock. Then we're going to pan further to the right, and I'm going to try to drive this ROV into the crevice, or at least close, to get a look in there. We actually filmed the same crevice in 2018 and saw both. I guess we saw just tadpoles. This time there's no tadpoles in the crevice, but as we pan over to the right, we see tadpoles right here, right at the entrance to that crevice. So again, seemingly very similar observations to what we made previously. And then panning a little further to the right, probably 10 feet away, we saw an adult mountain yellow-legged frog right here, just sitting on the bottom, just like they were doing during the other deployments in 2018. But again, remember that this guy is sitting there in complete darkness, now being illuminated, and he doesn't like that illumination, I don't think, and swims away. So I'm not going to bother that individual anymore. We'll just keep looking around for more of them. This is a shot of some bottom sediment right near those mid-depth boulders, and I just wanted to give you a sense of how much life is out there. And again, remember that this is total darkness. There's a water boatman swimming right here where my mouse pointer is. As the ROV goes across, skims over the bottom, you see all these mayflies jumping off the bottom. There is a ton of life, despite the fact that you're in extremely cold and dark conditions. Okay, lots of darkness here. And we're now going to take a tour down towards the deepest part of the lake, that area that we went through earlier. And wow, what an amazing contrast to the first footage of this that I showed you from 2018, where it was just a gray, brown, silty substrate. Now we've got this crazy, almost sort of psychedelic colors of orange and this brown background. Again, probably some sort of microbial mat, but who would have ever thought that it would be so colorful? I certainly wasn't. And I probably drove Tom and Erica crazy as I was yelling out what I was observing, and they were taking notes about. Here you have those yellow dots and this sort of white webby interconnecting material, whatever it might be. So still not a lot of topographic structure, but certainly a lot more variable than it is during early winter when it's just that uniform gray bottom. And you can see it just extends as far as you can see. Again, all the light here is coming from the ROV. It's pitch black. You do see mayflies jumping off the bottom occasionally here and there. So they're active on this bottom. But look at that. It just looks like a large expanse of orange, almost as far as you can see. So what we saw in late winter of 2018 with this really interesting colorful bottom is repeated here in midwinter. Okay, so now that was the challenging midwinter deployment. Now we're going to come back about a month and a half later, just as the edges of the lake begin to thaw. And now we have a lot more light coming through that ice, a lot more ambient light. We don't have to rely on the lights on the ROV so much, and it makes for much better observation and filming. So here we are. The ROV has just been put into the lake. There's, of course, the ice above. You can see how thin it has become and how relatively transparent it is. So there's these mid-depth boulders with a lot of light coming down compared to what we saw in midwinter. And again, it didn't take very long to run across our first mountain yellow-legged frog. And here's one, just like what we saw in 2018, sitting on this substrate in about 3 or 4 meters of water, facing shore. And this dark aggregation deserved some additional, an additional look. So I drove close to it. This is an aggregation of tadpoles just on the bottom, not near, not immediately adjacent to rocks, although it's in this mid-depth boulder area. And here's an adult right here. So again, we don't know why mountain yellow-legged frogs are aggregating like this as tadpoles in midwinter or near midwinter conditions, but they certainly are. Here's the largest tadpole aggregation that we encountered. It was encountered on this dive in late winter of 2019. That's about 200 or so mountain yellow-legged frog tadpoles all clustered together right next to this big boulder on your left-hand side. You can see the base of that boulder. That's typically where we found them. So most of the tadpoles aren't swimming. They're just sitting there. They can't be feeding because they're on top of other tadpoles. But whatever they're doing, it must be important because we see an awful lot of tadpoles in those aggregations. And then this is about 50 or so feet away from that other aggregation, another large aggregation of tadpoles. This one I think is particularly notable because not only is it tadpoles, but this right here, if you can see my mouse pointer as the ice yanks on the tether, That is an adult mountain yellow-legged frog. It's just sitting in that group of tadpoles. And again, you can imagine the ramifications for disease transmission, both tadpole to frog and frog to tadpole, not to mention tadpole to tadpole. And just to remind you, there's a lot going on there besides frogs. This is another water boatman that swam across my view as I was piloting the ROV to a different boulder. Seems quite unconcerned that it's 0 degrees Celsius. I included this one for comic relief. This is a tadpole. In the background, you see an adult. I unfortunately got a little too close, apparently, to this for this tadpole's liking. It swims off directly at the adult, and the adult will have none of that and swims back into deeper water. Sorry about that, guys. So here's another crevice. This is the crevice that I pointed out earlier where the tadpole tails were sticking out. We see exactly the same thing here. Their heads of the tadpoles are pushed into those crevices. Their tails are sticking out. And another aggregation, for whatever reason, on top of a rock. Probably 50 or so tadpoles sitting on this relatively isolated boulder for reasons that we have not yet figured out. Another aggregation here in a different spot, a mayfly there in the foreground, lots of zooplankton as well. So a large aggregation of tadpoles now, instead of being out there on that open substrate, they're in this overhang. So now we're just heading back towards the hole that we drilled in the ice, or in this case, the hole on that we deployed the ROV into, and that's the end of the 2019 deployments. So let me move this out of the way and get back to my final slide. So what did we learn? Well, we certainly learned that during winter, adults and tadpoles are common in that mid-depth boulder habitat type. It wasn't something we expected necessarily, but we also had no reason to expect they wouldn't be there. And in fact, they were there in abundance. We found both life stages, both adults and tadpoles, in dense aggregations, which, as I've mentioned, we don't understand why they're doing this. There's no obvious reason for it, and yet there they are. Interestingly, there was little use that we could see of the deep water habitat and the nearshore habitat. But as I mentioned previously, the use of undershore habitats, we weren't able to document that with the ROV, but I still think it's very likely. I think some fraction of these tadpoles and adults in the study lake are overwintering in those undershore habitats, and some fraction are overwintering in these mid-depth boulders and perhaps moving back and forth. I think both of those habitats are really important for overwintering, and I suspect they look very similar. These cracks and other features that protect them from ice and predators, etc. So that's a pretty different picture emerging from what we would be led to believe by the little bit of information that we had available before these deployments, that mountain yellow-legged frogs are probably out there in the deep water. They're probably thinly dispersed or widely dispersed. In fact, they're aggregating, they are abundant in these particular habitat types. And because of that aggregation, there's probably some really important implications for the transmission of the amphibian chytrid fungus during these winter conditions. So I will leave it at that. I hope you've enjoyed your tour. It was certainly a real joy for us to make these discoveries and to really, for the first time, begin to feel like we understood a little bit more about what mountain yellow-legged frogs and all these other creatures experience for the majority of their life. And that is complete blackness and extreme cold. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks, Roland. That was really cool. And I know we're going to have questions. So folks out there, if you'd like to just type in your questions that you have into the Q&A box, Roland can start fielding those. And I think before people have questions typed in yet, I'm going to just read a few things that have come in on the chat. And a couple of folks here were commenting on Dr. Tom Jenkins doing some under ice diving back in the late 60s, early 70s. And if you have any information from what he was looking at down there at that time that might shed some light on what you're seeing.
Yeah, I know that Tom did that. Tom and I have talked about that a lot in the past. I don't know, I don't remember, I should probably say, I don't remember exactly what he was interested in for that work. I suspect it was something related to trout, but I don't remember very much about it besides Tom saying that was the craziest thing I've ever done. That is, drill a large hole in the ice and then dive down through the ice. I don't think the University of California would be too thrilled with us doing a similar thing in this day and age. So Scott asked the question, could you talk about where tadpoles go in the summer at night? Do they go into the same habitats they go in the winter? That's a very insightful question, Scott, because we actually have another deployment of the ROV scheduled this coming summer to figure exactly that out. That is, after the tadpoles during the day, as I mentioned, and as I showed you in that photograph at the beginning of my talk, tadpoles aggregate in these warm water nearshore habitats, taking advantage of that warm water to speed up their metabolism. At night, again, if you read the literature, there's a lot of statements about they just swim down to the deepest part of the lake. It's beginning to sound awfully familiar. And I suspect that you're right, Scott, that they utilize the same habitats at nighttime in the summer that they utilize in winter, those habitats that I just showed you. But we'll see if the ROV proves that true or not. I'm really interested to figure that out. And I suspect that may be true for both the mid-depth boulder type habitats and the undershore habitats. I've made a lot of observations over the years of, as the day is getting started in midsummer, the sun's coming up, the air temperatures are warming. I made observations that suggest to me that the adults are coming out. They're suddenly appearing at the shore. I think they're coming out of those overwintering habitats. I'm sorry, those undershore habitats that they overwinter in as well. So Henry asked the question, were there no fish in this lake? Did you know that ahead of time? And yes, we did know that. This is a lake that was stocked at one time, and then it lost its fish population due to a lack of stocking and a lack of spawning habitat for those fish. And so it's now been fishless for the better part of about 50 years. And as a consequence, it has returned to really good habitat for things like mountain yellow-legged frogs, mayflies, all those taxa that trout wipe out as a result of predation. So we specifically chose this lake because it was fishless and therefore had a good chance of being good habitat for mountain yellow-legged frogs.
Okay, any more questions out there before I jump in? Because I really am curious about the chytrid transmission and temperature, and whether or not you think the chytrid transmission is as significant in these cold temperatures in winter as it might be in the warmer temperatures in summer.
Yeah, I mean, the chytrid fungus certainly has, as you would hear in the scientific lingo, a thermal optimum. Mm-hmm. So at about 15 degrees Celsius is that optimum. So that's when it's growing fastest, it's reproducing fastest, but it has quite a wide tolerance for temperature, and it can continue growing and continue reproducing at essentially 0 degrees, as well as at quite warm temperatures up to about 26 degrees Celsius. So there have been a lot of studies done in the laboratory looking at that temperature relationship. And the general conclusions that we've reached from that is that transmission is likely to be lower under these cold wintertime conditions than it is during midsummer, but it might be largely offset by the fact that even in winter, these animals are aggregating the way they are. So there's no question that transmission is occurring, because we have in this particular study lake, as well as lots of other study lakes in the Sierra, we have populations in which every adult is marked. They're tagged. So we can identify individuals, which means we can catch an individual just before it goes into this sort of hibernation period in early winter and figure out how infected it is with the amphibian chytrid fungus. And then we can catch that same frog 8 or 9 months later, just as it's coming out of its hibernation. And what we keep finding is that the infection burden, basically how infected that animal is, does not change over the entire winter. So that is largely explained, we think, by the fact that even though transmission, or let's say growth of the amphibian chytrid fungus is lower, reproductive rates are lower, they're sitting on top of each other. So they're just transmitting the fungus between them.
Yeah.
So Scott asked, do the frogs and tadpoles have any predators under ice in the winter? Tadpoles probably. There are some large beetles, for example, that would be in these lakes in the winter. They overwinter the same way that the frogs do and the tadpoles do. But in a lake that is in its natural fishless condition, that's probably the most obvious example of a potential predator. But I do think, even though I mentioned that the habitats in which they seem to be favoring during winter are habitats that provide protection from predators potentially, there probably isn't a lot of predation. And then Scott, if you combine tag frogs with the ROV work, perhaps you will find the frogs go back to the same crevices every year in winter or night in the summer. And I suspect that's true. These frogs, they don't have in the summertime with a tag frog, you don't find that tag frog in exactly the same spot every single day, but you do find them in generally the same area. So they do have some affinity for particular areas, but an individual frog over the course of several days will in fact go to multiple places around the lake, even leave the lake and go into the inlet or the outlet and then come back into the lake. But I suspect that they do have at least some affinity for particular crevices. Unfortunately, we don't have a tag reader on the nose of that ROV. We would love to have one. We could drive it around and not just say, oh, there's a frog, but figure out which frog it is.
So Roland, there's a couple questions in the chat too. And one of them is, how hard was it to get the ROV back up that 15-foot deep hole in the ice?
We were actually quite worried about that, especially since we had borrowed Stacy Brown's ROV for this. It wasn't, at the outset, it wasn't clear that we were going to easily be able to even find the hole, except by following the tether, much less driving the ROV right back up. But luckily, we deployed the ROV in such a way that we could just gently reel it in by the tether without disturbing or harming that fiber optic cable. But we specifically set up the ROV for that particular possibility so that we could retrieve it by the tether in case we needed to, and we did.
Yeah.
If we hadn't had that ability, I think that ROV might still be in the lake.
So one more question in the chat about temperature, and what's the lowest water temperature or range of temperatures that those frogs can survive in?
We don't know for sure, but I mean, the temperature, so that ROV has on it a thermometer. So it's actually showing us not just the video, but it's actually showing us real-time temperatures as well. And so when we were doing those overwinter deployments, whether it was early winter, midwinter, or late winter, it was always between 0 and 4 degrees. But the question then is, well, how much colder than 0 could these frogs tolerate? We know that some frogs, leopard frogs, for example, that overwinter under the ice, much like mountain yellow-legged frogs do, and from which the original idea came that they might just be sitting out there on the bottom, which is what leopard frogs do. Those frogs actually have antifreeze in their tissues that allow them to survive at temperatures below 0 degrees. David Bradford, who did some early amazing pioneering work on mountain yellow-legged frog physiology in the 1970s, did some laboratory experiments where he looked at whether these frogs could survive temperatures below 0, and they can't survive much below 0, maybe to -1 Celsius, but that's about it. So they don't have these same, they don't appear to have these same antifreeze properties that some other animals, including amphibians and Antarctic fish and such have.
Mm-hmm. All right, cool. Well, I think I don't see any more questions, Roland, so I will let you take a rest. And I really appreciate you presenting on this because it was fascinating and certainly the first time I've seen anything like that. So thank you, and keep us posted on what's going on.
I will do that. Thank you,
All
Carol.
right. All right. Good night, everyone.